Let's talk about memory. So how many different types of memory do you know? So just very quickly, quick quiz. List how many types of memory. I'll give you 5 seconds of thinking music. Da 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 da. Ding dong ding dong ding. Okay, time's up. Most of you probably easily thought of long-term memory and short-term memory. And I've got, by the way, I've got a score thermometer there. It seemed like a smart idea when I made the slide to have a thermometer there. I'm not too sure anymore. Anyway, there's a score thermometer to keep track of how we're going. Most people will think of long-term memory and short-term memory. And if you thought of long-term memory and short-term memory as types of memory, then great, you get a couple of points. Excellent. Some people might have come up with medium-term memory. Now, I'm guessing a lot less of you know about medium-term memory than long-term memory and short-term memory. And we'll talk about all of these types in a second. So if you guessed medium-term memory, then you get another point. Some of you may have thought about holographic memory. And there's a lot of discussion about how memory might be holographic, might be stored holographically in our, not just in our brain, but throughout our body, and some might even say beyond. So holographic memory gets your point. I'm guessing not too many people thought of implicit and explicit memory, or at least those terms. So if you came up with implicit and explicit memory, you get a point. If you came up with unconscious and conscious, then they're basically the same thing, so you can get a point as well. And the last type of memory I want to talk about for this little section is semantic memory and episodic memory. And for the moment, let me just say they're interesting words, and I'll explain what they mean in a second. But I'm also guessing not too many people know the difference between semantic memory and episodic memory. And if you've got all of those different types of memory, if you listed them all, then you get whatever it was, 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 points, how many of it was. If you didn't, don't worry, because you're going to know them all very, very shortly. Let's have a look at this. Types of memory. This takes that same information and gives it a bit of structure. So holographic memory is interesting, but I don't really want to talk about holographic memory now, so let's just get rid of that. Let's talk about the more traditional types of memory. You probably all have heard about short-term memory. Usually short-term memory is related to memory that is remembering things for less than a minute. So if you wanted to enter a phone number into your phone, somebody tells you the number, you're using short-term memory to remember that number whilst you enter it into the phone. Unless there's some reason to remember that number and shift it into long-term memory, you're going to forget it within seconds. It's just memory that you use. It's working memory that you use for everyday life. If you're cooking dinner and you need a can of beans or something from the cupboard, so you walk to the cupboard and you open the cupboard door and you look in, and has this ever happened to you? You walk to a cupboard and you open it and you look in and you go, why am I here? What am I supposed to be getting out of this cupboard? Does that ever happen to you? Well, if it does, that's your short-term memory playing tricks on you. Remembering why you walked to the cupboard or why you opened the door. If the doorbell rings and you walk to the door and you open the door, it's your short-term memory that makes you remember the reason you're opening the door is because the doorbell rang. So it's working memory. Lasts for under a minute or so. Long-term memory is memory that you keep for a lifetime. And there's, as you can see from our little chart here, there's different types. There's explicit and implicit long-term memory, and then the explicit can be broken up into episodic, semantic, and we'll talk about those in a second. But basically, anything that lasts longer than a minute or so, we generally used to think as long-term memory. If you remember something that happened to you in childhood, if you remember something that happened to you a year ago or 3 years ago or 10 years ago, that's all long-term memory. Recently, researchers have discovered that there's a medium-term memory, which is basically there's a memory that lasts up to 6 months, and it seems to be a memory that's used to organise thoughts and to determine whether things really need to be learnt or not. So back to my students studying for an exam, what they were trying to do was cram their medium-term memory with information so that they could do an exam. And odds are, given a day or two, let alone 6 months, given a day or two after the exam, they'll have forgotten the information, or a fair amount of the information, because they didn't incorporate any strategies to move the information into their long-term memory. So we fundamentally have this medium-term memory, lasts for about 6 months. We use it to store information that might be important or might not be important. The brain hasn't quite decided how and if it's going to store it. And if that information proves to be something that we need to remember, then it'll be shifted into long-term memory. All right, let's have a look at implicit memory. Implicit memory is your unconscious memory. And for the sake of this drawing, I'm going to say that implicit memory is mostly made up of procedural memory. So procedural memory are skills, the skills, like how do you know how to walk? How do you remember? You learned to walk as a child. How do you still remember to walk when you wake up of a morning? How is it that you don't need to relearn how to walk? Well, it's your procedural memory that is keeping that information. You don't need to think about it. It's all quite unconscious. How do you know how to make a cup of coffee, or how to make a bean salad, or how do you know how to fill out an insurance form? Those skills are procedural skills that are stored in your implicit memory. You're not thinking about them. They just happen to be there at an unconscious level. Things you've learnt unconsciously, and specifically procedural skills on how to do things. Explicit memory is conscious memory, things that you are consciously aware of and that you can recall and articulate, that you can talk about. There are two types of explicit memory, episodic and semantic. Episodic memory is the memory of episodes. Episodic is episode. They're memory of events and experiences. So if you could recall your wedding day, or your 10th birthday, or that day the boss shouted at you, or the day you first met your true love, those specific moments in time that relate to a specific day and a specific event, that is episodic memory, events and experiences that go back into your history, specific events in your history. That is episodic memory. You may not remember the exact date, but you do remember the day. Semantic memory are facts and concepts. Your name, for example, you know your name, most likely, and that's a fact that you store in semantic memory. You don't remember the day specifically that you learnt your name. That episode, the day where you learnt your name, it probably wasn't a specific day. It's something that you learnt over time. So there are facts. The fact that ice is made out of frozen water, you don't remember the day you learnt that, but you remember that as a fact. How to add, how to multiply, how to drive a car. These are all parts of semantic memory. They're facts, they're concepts, they're ideas that don't necessarily relate specifically to a particular day or event in your life, but are just all the facts and information that you remember about how the world works. Now that's a traditional view of memory and a traditional model of memory, and I want to add a little bit now, which is basically my take on all of this. So this next bit is mine. Episodic memory and semantic memory can be chunked up into different types of memory, or different things that you're remembering. So you can remember facts or sensations or emotions or associations. So let me deal with those. So let's deal with an episode. Let's deal with your 10th birthday. If you remember your 10th birthday, you might remember the fact that you were 10. You might remember the fact of where it was. Was it at home, or was it at the bowling alley, or did you go to McDonald's? You might remember who was there. Was it school friends, or was it family? These are all facts. These are all things that you can rattle off and list down. These are the facts of the occasion, a list of information. But you also would remember sensations. Sensations could be, they're a little bit like emotions, but they're a little bit different as well. So sensations are, were you moving? Were you sitting down? Did you have a funny feeling in your tummy? Did you have flip-flops in your tummy? So, for example, when the first time I met this young lady I ended up marrying, I actually had a queasy sensation in my tummy. There was a sensation of, I guess, excitement, and I was enamored by her. And I actually had a physical sensation of queasiness is the only way to describe it. Excitement and nervousness, the physical feeling of excitement and nervousness are very, very, very similar, very hard to tell them apart, which is when you move to emotion. So love, excitement, happiness, disappointment, nervousness are the emotions that I would describe, something separate to the sensations. So you can rattle off who was there, and you might have had a sensation of excitement, but you might have had the emotion of happiness. And then there are the associations, and they're the things connected with the various memories. You might have an association with your 10th birthday that it was a great day, or 10th birthday party, that it was a great day. You might have the association this was a happy day in your childhood, which could have an association that you had a great childhood. You could have the inverse. You could have an association that your 10th birthday was a great day in your childhood, but that might be associated with the concept that you had a rotten childhood, and this day then stands out. So it might be an example of how great your childhood was, or it could be an example of how lousy your childhood was, depending on how you associate that memory and those parts of those memories, the facts, the sensations and the emotions, with other memories and other thoughts, both episodic and semantic. Let's do an experiment. Let's do an experiment to bring this home. So I want you to think of a dog. So get a mental image of a dog. And I'm going to do a bit of magic here. I'm going to guess what dog you're thinking of. So get a clear mental image of a dog, and I'm going to try and guess the dog you're thinking of. Okay, ready? Here we go. Is this it? Ah, it was. Very good. Okay, that's good to see. So that's the dog. I've got to say, every time I see that picture, I think I did used to own that dog once. I'll tell you what, I did actually own all of these dogs, not these specific dogs, but dogs. I've had a Shepherd, I've had the Jack Russell. What is that second one? Whatever it is, I used to have one when I was a kid. Had a Labrador. So, dogs. Let's think about dogs for a second. If you were using episodic memory, you'd be thinking something about a specific day or a specific event. I recall once that my youngest son, Christopher, was once attacked by a couple of roosters. We had some roosters, and we lived on a property and we had some roosters. And the roosters actually started attacking my little fellow when he was about 18 months of age. And the dogs actually came and rescued Christopher. The dogs came and grabbed the roosters, the dogs grabbed them with their jaw and sort of flicked their head and threw the rooster. Didn't actually do any damage to the rooster, but grabbed the rooster and flicked the rooster. There were 2 dogs and 2 roosters, 2 German Shepherds and 2 roosters, and the dogs grabbed the roosters and flung the roosters away out of harm's reach and sort of protected the child. And that's a specific episode, a specific memory of a specific day, and I've just given you the facts of that, but the sensation, of me running, of the dogs, of the sounds. So the sensations can be the sounds, or any physical feelings, the sounds of my boy crying, of the dogs barking, of the roosters making rooster noises. Those sensations, sounds and feelings I had are all very real to me. I was very emotional at the time. I was very fearful for my son, and I was shocked. And I relate the association the association I have of that memory is of those dogs being very brave and being very caring and very protective. I have an association that dogs are very protective animals, and they will protect the family, and so I have those associations. So that's an example of episodic memory, and you might have a similar sort of memory. Or you might have, when you think of a dog, you might use your semantic memory. So you may not think of a specific day or a specific episode or a specific time or in a specific event. You might go, dogs. All right, I know dogs. They come in different breeds. They have 4 legs. Some have pointy ears, some have floppy ears. They have wet noses. These are all facts. These are all facts. Though a wet nose, if you think it has a wet nose, then that's a fact. But if you can sort of think of the feeling of touching a wet nose, that's a sensation. You know what touching the wet nose of a dog feels like. You know what it feels like being licked by a dog, or patting a dog, or the smell of a wet dog. A dog, as you're washing it, has a particular smell. They're sensations. You can have your emotions. You might love dogs. You might hate dogs. You might be totally afraid of dogs. You might be disgusted in them. You might think they're terrible, terrible animals. So there could be some very positive or very negative emotions that you have related to dogs. And of course, you can have some associations. And if you're fearful of dogs, there might be a specific episodic memory that you have, or you may not know why you're fearful of dogs. You just have this association that they're a thing to be feared, or you might have an association that dogs are great, and you have some thoughts. There's the difference between episodic and semantic memory. A specific event that has facts, sensations, emotions, associations, or more generalized facts, sensations, emotions, and associations. So I think you get the example.